According to good morning. It's 7:30-ish. It's Friday morning, so it's time for Coffee, Buses and Politics. We're joined this morning by Stuart Locke, friend of the show, fearless battler against Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in joke. And most importantly, the CEO of Advantage Schools, which is a MAT, a multi-academy trust, mostly in fact, I think all of your schools are in Bedford, aren't they, Stuart?
Bedford, Central Beds and Luton.
Central Beds and Luton. So really glad to have you on, because we are going to be talking about education. And talk about it fairly in the round, but mostly we wanted to start with the recent Ofsted changes. But Stuart, if it's okay, do you want to give us just a sort of quick pen portrait of Stuart Locke and of Advantage Schools?
Sure, really happy to. Thank you very much for having me, and good morning, everyone. I'm Stuart Locke. I'm a lifelong teacher. I've been a teacher since I left university, and was a secondary head teacher. Used to be the head teacher at Cotman Village College in Cambridgeshire, and I live in Hertford, Huntingdon. I run a charity, Advantage Schools, which runs 10 schools now in, as I said, Bedford, Central Bedfordshire and Luton. We run primary schools, secondary schools and sixth form, and very proud to do so. The reason for our existence, I suppose you'd say, is that we, like I fundamentally think that education in England can be significantly better than it is now, and that's not to, it's really important, it's not to say anything about specific schools, and we try to show how we can run schools we think significantly better than before, and share everything and so on. So, and I'm sure we'll get into lots of that stuff as well. But my background is secondary head teacher and a maths teacher.
Brilliant. I should probably start, or in fact, I am going to start by saying we have some new things for the show. Morning, Martin. We do have a new website at www.coffeebusesandpolitics.com, and we have assorted social media things which will be scrolling across your screen now. So do please like, follow, share. And it does really help us, particularly if you could like the Facebook page, because we don't have enough people liking us on there to let us live stream. So if you could do that, that would be great. Or if you go to coffeebusesandpolitics.com, there is now an ask a question feature. So you can, if you want to put in a question in advance, you can, of course. If not, the chat is still there, whichever platform you're on. Recently, Ofsted announced that it's going to be changing how it reports the gradings of its schools, because we had the system was a one-word headline description, and following the tragic death of a head teacher after their school was downgraded, that came under a lot of scrutiny and so on. So I think the report is going to be largely the same, but the sort of headline figure is going to be different. Stuart, do you think that makes any difference?
I don't know. So the first, good question. Just to give the background, Ruth Perry died in January of 2023 when her school in Reading, Caversham Primary, was graded inadequate. And the consequences of an inadequate judgment on a school, that one-word judgment, can be really significant and severe. And the coroner to her death, her suicide, said that the Ofsted judgment contributed undoubtedly to her death. I may have got the quote not exactly right, and I think it's important that we just pause and reflect on that, and that we use it as a source of information, because I think that's a useful thing, aspect of where it's come. come from. The new government, the Labour government, as a manifesto commitment, said that they would remove the one-word grading on schools. I think with the perception that that is the kind of high stakes nature, that one word can't summarize a school, that it's not particularly useful for parents and so on. And your question was, will it make a difference? Well, the first thing is that the replacement for the one word grade isn't coming into effect until September 2025. And we don't know exactly what the report card, as the Secretary of State has called it, is going to look like, what it's going to encompass. I think the critical question it may be how it changes leaders of schools' behaviour, because that will depend on what we are held accountable for. In the meantime, the Ofsted inspections will be largely the same. There are some tweaks, except for it just won't have an overall grade on it. So at the moment, we're graded for 4 areas in the school: quality of education, which usually takes up, is weighted to be 2/3 to 3/4 of the overall grade, as it should be, right? Quality of education, personal development, behaviour, broadly, I can't remember the exact phrase, and leadership and management. And so those 4 grades will continue to exist. If you look at an Ofsted inspection, which you can see, those individual areas are individually graded, and they come together to make a one-word grade. And I think this is critical. I think that the high-stakes nature of an Ofsted inspection isn't really the grade, it's the consequences of the grade. And the consequences of the grade, I think, is a governance issue in schools. So I run 10 schools. Nobody in any of my schools has ever or will ever be sacked purely because of an Ofsted inspection. But that's not the case everywhere. It's not the case necessarily in local authorities or in school trusts like I run, charities like I run. And it might be the case that that's the consequence of being high stakes. But and critically, this is baked into the system. It's a statutory responsibility of Ofsted, which won't change, which is that Ofsted have to label or decide when a school requires statutory intervention from the government. I.e., at the moment, if you get an inadequate judgment overall, or you get 2 consecutive requires improvement judgments, which is like the 3rd judgment, then you're labelled for statutory intervention. It doesn't mean anything necessarily happens, but if one of my schools met that criteria, it might get taken off my organisation and given to another organisation. If it's a local authority school, it might get academised. That means moved into a charity like the one that I run, or whatever it might be. It also might not, because they might produce an action plan that says, actually, we know how to fix this school and so on. That's still going to exist. Ofsted still have to identify which schools need statutory intervention and which don't. And the Secretary of State on Radio 4, the day after the announcement, the 1st of September, I think it was, said that statutory intervention would kick in if any of the 4 grades were inadequate themselves. So that high stakes nature is still there for each of the 4 grades for this year. Now, the reason I started with I don't know is because I don't know what that will be come September 2025, when we have a new report card, which she's promised we will have and will be developed with the profession between now and then. But I think the high stakes nature comes down to that statutory intervention criteria. And I think that's the critical bit that we need to be cognizant of. And I'm not sure you can change that in some ways, because education is high stakes for pupils in schools, for young people in schools. They only get one chance, right? So if we mess it up, we've messed it up for them for life. That is high stakes for them. We can't change those stakes. So in some ways, I'm not completely opposed to there being some level of there has to be some level of stakes. It's a very important public service.
Sorry, Martin, go ahead.
Yeah, I just the question I would ask is how confident would you be that Ofsted get it right every time? And I suspect I know the answer to that, but there's an issue for me way back in when I was a cabinet member. The county children's services were ranked as inadequate, and I absolutely remain 100% convinced that Ofsted got it wrong. Absolutely convinced of it, and actually when we were assessed at the time, a year later, we went from being inadequate to excellent, and that's a good sign that Ofsted did get it wrong, and we could have challenged it actually and didn't. And I suspect the same thing happens with some schools, that Ofsted make misjudgments for various reasons and get it wrong. And I'd like to know your view on it.
So education's a human endeavour, and it's really hard to have absolute validity and reliability of any inspection. Like, I think that's true, and I think that's kind of baked into the system. There are multiple hundreds of thousands of factors at play in an individual school. And so I would absolutely agree that so the first thing is, it's an indicator. And it's for parents. I think that's critical as well. It's not for school leaders and so on. It's for parents, and we have to bear that in mind. Like, without a regulator, I think we have a more difficult situation. And so that's it's just a good background for us. I've had an Ofsted inspection grade changed as a result of an intervention, a complaint, which some might argue is healthy. I think that Ofsted inspections are not as valid as they could be, and if I have to be honest, I think it's because I think the inspectorate is not as good as it could be, and isn't as consistent as it could be. And I think it's right that there are school, like the best, let's say the best requires improvement school is definitely better than the worst good school, right? Like it's not as clear cut as that. And I think that that's probably behind a bit of the kind of cutoff for where people are saying an individual one-word grade is so high stakes, it's labeling a school and so on, and yet you can't be 100% confident it is that grade. And I think that's a valid thing to say. But I think that's still going to be the case with statutory intervention. They still have to decide statutory intervention or not. That's still the high stakes cutoff. Now, what I would say about Ofsted, so I sort of agree with you, but I also don't want it to come across that I'm suggesting that we shouldn't have a regulator. Like, we absolutely should have a regulator, and they should be making judgments on schools. I tell you what I think Ofsted do well. I think they play the role of a hygiene inspector in restaurants really well. I think they are really reliable about inspecting safeguarding, and the issue at Caversham Primary in Reading was a safeguarding issue, and we shouldn't shy away from that. We need people to keep an eye on where kids might not be safe in schools. I think they do stuff well on, for example, exam entries, some good stuff on behaviour. I think they play the role of a hygiene inspector really well, but I don't think they're a good food critic. I don't think that if you want them to really inspect like a good curriculum, to get into the weeds of whether mathematics is taught really well through in a secondary school 7 years, whether the progression is there, whether assessment is right, and so on, I don't think you can do that in a few visits to lessons as a sample. I just don't think you can. So I think that if I was in charge, and I don't think this is on the cards, but if I was in charge, I would be suggesting that we are more regular with the hygiene inspector aspects of an inspection, and we start to accept that it's probably much less reliable and valid to be trying to play the role of a food critic. And I think that comes to your point. But the last thing to just point out, and I may have the figures not exactly right here, 89% of schools in this country are graded as good or better. Now, I don't believe that 89% of schools are good or better. Like, I just don't. Like, and I'm hugely protective of my colleagues up and down the country. There's 23,000 schools, but I just don't think that that can be reflective of the situation we're in, because there are too many kids, if I'm frank, who leave school illiterate and enumerate, and so and with very poor examination results. And I guess this speaks to what I'm talking about with a hygiene inspector. If Ofsted come in and say you're not in the top 89% of schools, there's probably something wrong with the school that needs to be fixed quite urgently. Like, that's what I would suggest. And that's not even the threshold for statutory intervention. It's much lower than that, because so I just want to like we need to bear that in mind. And I don't know if it's worth just talking briefly about Caversham Primary, because I think there are some lessons we just need to not hide from there that are really important. I hugely respect Ruth Perry's sister Julia, who's campaigned for the lessons from her death. I think there are a couple of things that, and I respect the coroner's report. And I don't really have a but to that. Like, I think it's really important that we do that. I think as well as that, we just have to ask some questions. Like, a head teacher should never be in a position where they don't know what they don't know walking into an Ofsted inspection. And I haven't seen anybody ask the local authority, why is that the case? A head teacher should not be in a position of leading an outstanding school, it becoming inadequate and everyone going, hang on a minute, we didn't know this, because of safeguarding issues. And there's a key question, I think, for the governance of that school and governance generally about what was going on to support that head teacher or to make sure that those kids were okay in that school. And I think that part is sort of ignored in this tragic event. And I think it's really important. Like, there are 23,000 schools. Really important we kind of we pull that, you know, we're aware and learn those lessons around that. I think that's critical. And then I've kind of gone off the point, but let me just come back to an adjacent point to yours, Martin, which is that it is definitely the case that we know that a kind of like Ofsted inspections should be uncomfortable because we know that it's going to be public. And this is why I think it's not a credible position to kind of suggest we shouldn't or the regulator should not exist. Because we know it's going to be public, it drives an element of kind of positive engagement in like making sure things are better, like outside of the Ofsted inspection itself. And I think that's an important aspect of keeping quality like a bit higher. But I accept, like, in my very long answer, I accept the kind of premise of your question that if a school is good, I don't think you should assume it's as good as the school down the road that's good, particularly because most schools in this country are labelled good, right? So, yeah.
Is that a specific Ofsted thing, or is that inspecting? Like, would it be different with Estyn in Wales, or is that because the way we set it up, or is that just the reality of inspecting schools that you can go in and you can check the safeguarding policies and see if it's being followed and so on, but actually getting a feel for the quality of the education is much harder and will always be much harder.
Yeah, so it depends on your focus. So there's a political question here. If you go back to not the previous Chief Inspector, Amanda Spielman, but before that, the Chief Inspector before that, Sir Michael Wilshaw, under him we had a framework that was very much focused on outcomes, on the results that pupils achieve at the end of their time in schools. And as a result, I think it was much easier to predict what Ofsted grade you would get when they walked into your school, because it depended on your data to a much greater extent. Like, it was much more reliable inspection. I'd argue it wasn't necessarily as valid because I'm not sure that the data always shows how good a school is now. It shows how good the school was over the last 7 years in the case of a secondary school, and 7 years in a primary school as well. So it might have felt like it was more reliable, it was more predictable, and then also, like, what's the point? Just publish the results. So that is the other thing. The last framework, and when I say framework, I mean the criteria by which inspectors carry out the inspection and judge a school, focused more on the substance of education, tried to get into the curriculum and so on. And I think that was a good thing to try to do. I think the analogy of hygiene inspector and food critic has really come to bear, and I think there's been some stark unreliability. Like, I think there's too much. It's too arguable in a sense. So I feel like a politician myself because I feel like I'm avoiding your question, but like I think it's kind of baked in a little bit. But there are also some structural things under, I think it was under Michael Gove as Secretary of State, but I may be mistaken, so forgive me if I'm wrong. I think that the schools which were graded as outstanding were deemed exempt from inspection. In fact, it might have been before Michael Gove. I may be mistaken on that. So that meant that you had outstanding schools that weren't inspected like ever. There was a kind of desktop exercise to make sure they were okay, and then they just weren't inspected. And so you've had outstanding schools that have a 15-year gap between inspections. That's been removed. And I wonder, like, if I was a conspiracy theorist, I'd be like, well, that's very convenient. It means the proportion of schools that are good or better goes up, because if you're great, you don't get inspected. If you're rubbish, you get inspected. So there's only one way the figures go then, right? So, and I just like when you hear the like Conservative MPs now talking about how under their watch I think, again, the figures I've from my head, so I might be wrong. We've gone from 68% of schools graded good or better to 89% of schools graded good or better. Like, there's no substance behind those figures. That's just like reflective of a whole load of things that have gone into the mix. And I think we need to be really careful around like just assuming proportions are right. So I think I've answered your question, which is that I think it's fundamental about inspection, but there's other things as well. Like, you can't be completely valid and reliable, but you have to make a kind of political choice or a choice about what you're going to focus on. But there's also, and it's a human endeavor, but also there are some other factors like that come into play as well.
Can I ask a more fundamental question? Sorry, I know David wants to move on as well, but I have a view that strictly speaking, education is basically still based on a 19th century ethos, and it's about time we did some radical stuff to rethink it. So I'd like to put the student in charge of their own examination timetable, if you want, so to speak, so that we examine students when they're ready to be examined and when ready to progress to another level, rather than the system where the state says we're going to examine you every May because we've always examined you every May. And I just think, is it time that we started to be a bit more radical around where we are with education?
I mean, we could have this could be another 4 hours of conversation. That's a 120-year-old argument that David and I were talking about before we came live, between people like John Dewey in the progressive education and people like more recently in the 20th century Michael Oakeshott and R.S. Peters. And the question is, like, the understandable, R.S. Peters described this in the 60s, so it's not an argument now. The understandable, he said, and this is broadly a quote, the understandable focus of the progressives on the child, putting the child in the center, means that they focus far more on the manner of education than on the matter of education. Now, this became really big actually under the last Labour government. Under the last Labour government, we had personalised learning. There was talk of, and I was involved in a group, there was talk of like scrapping exams altogether. We were supposed to focus, like subjects were pretty much got rid of. The proposal was subjects would pretty much be got rid of, and there'd be like quite a significant kind of cross-curricular emphasis on the skills that young people should develop. The problem, of course, is that all those skills are outcomes of education. They're not really a very good method of developing the skills themselves. Like it's a bit like a comedian needs to be funny. Like, trying to get him to practice being funny isn't like you need to like come down to the components of how to become like a team worker, an independent inquirer, a creative thinker, and so on. And so the approach to education of do pupils need to master a body of knowledge that's been handed down by human history versus do pupils need to kind of develop what's inside them? That's a philosophical argument that's gone on for a long time, which I think this comes to. Your specific argument at exams, like my position on exams is this: I think exams are imperfect measures of what pupils know, but I don't think there's a better way. Like, I think everything else privileges the most advantage more than examinations do. They're impersonal, and that's what's good about them. And I think that every proposal that comes up to like use a different method of assessing kids, without exception, privileges those that are most privileged, have most support from home, and so on, and feeds into those biases. But that's it's a much bigger conversation.
I have really strong feelings about exams, because I don't know, I did much better in my A-level exams than my brother did. I think most people would objectively say my brother is much more intelligent than I am, and he later on went on to do. I mean, he not to brag, he went to University of Wales College of Medicine, which no longer exists, and so he does actually have the joint highest final score for the for the entire university's history. Went to Oxford, all of this sort of stuff. But what the exams tested was, I felt, was how good your memory. I have quite a good memory, and I could memorize to a certain extent the sort of essay answers you had to put down, and so I did quite well in exams. And it's like, that was great for me, but I don't know. Maybe there isn't a better way of doing it. But
at university, I basically learned how to pass exams at university. Was the biggest skill I left with, which is practically useless in the real world.
My perspective isn't about getting rid of exams, actually, and it goes back to something. So when I joined the army, I joined the army at 16. The course I did was an ammunition technician's apprenticeship. Okay, at a place called Chepstow, and when we did throughout 2 years of that apprenticeship, we did exams about every couple of months, and if we failed 3 of those exams, we would be kicked off the course. Basically, it was a really tough course, and quite rightly, it needed to be tough as well. But the way they examined us, and bearing in mind this was 81 to 83, was that when we taught that subject, they would go to a computer, press a button, and it would randomly generate an exam for us to do based on a random selection of question banks. Now, I think that if they could do that in 1981, they could do the same in the education system now. And what it would be about is seeing students generally progress up a table based on a more personalized view, but maintaining the rigor of examinations, just putting the focus on examining a student when they're ready to be examined. But what it also does is, there's a One Nationist, ladders of opportunity are there. And this is the beginnings of that. Not every student can reach the top, but every student can see the next level. And one of the issues with education is if you go into secondary school and from your primary experience, you're not an academic, you're basically being set up to fail for 5 years. It's really, I think that's really tough. And I just think thinking about it a bit differently might actually create better outcomes for everybody. And in terms of what you were saying, Stuart, about equalising education and about some education being right for those people that are better supported and everything else, it's trying to switch that round that I think is absolutely vital.
I wonder if the argument is more about also how we're using like those results, because like think about this, and I did school in Romania, so people who complain about memory skills, they should go through school in Romania where you're actually really testing your memory and reproducing everything that's like in some of the books, especially on like literature and other things. But I was very similar to what David was saying. Like I was really good at like doing the exams. Like I got like the equivalent of like the 3 A stars in like in the what was equivalent to A levels to get into uni here. But then when you get here, you realize you're lacking like all those skills that other people who went to education in different contexts have, like debating, like interpersonal stuff, because you're super good at like just doing the the facts base and like the memory skills, but you're not good at actually interacting with people. Whether that is something that can be taught or not, it's a different debate, because it can just be how your personality expresses itself in the workplace and so on. But what really was really interesting for me is how we're actually using those results like later on when people want to go in certain certain jobs or further education. And I'll give this, the classic example of, for example, me, I don't have any qualification in maths, but I'm doing a finance job like alongside counsel without having like a specific qualification in anything that's like, STEM related. However, like in a lot of jobs, you can't really do this based on like, oh, you're just, good at it, even if you're not qualified in it, because you'll be like, you'll have that opportunity that Martin is speaking about to even like enter that specific workplace or, further degree, because you didn't do the right qualifications early enough. And it's a bit difficult to kind of like change it later on. So I guess I think it's partly the question around how are we testing knowledge, but also how that knowledge is used later on in further education, employment, and what assumptions we might or we might not have as as employers, for example, to actually assess whether someone is fit for the job based on formal and more like, again, work experience related qualifications.
I just want to say, like, the point of my schools is not to get kids, is like the primary point is not to get kids to pass exams. that's a byproduct. And if we don't have pupils who pass exams, we're probably not doing a good job. I think that's a decent measure. The point of my schools, and we say this explicitly, is that, and this relates to the academic curriculum. Like, I don't think there is a pupil who's not academic, certainly not one that we should label at age 11 at that. But and I think that GCSEs themselves are fairly low bar, if I'm honest, at age 16. But here's the critical bit for me. I think every young person has the right, the entitlement to join the community of educated citizens. And what I mean by that is there's this body of knowledge that everybody on this call shares. I'll give you an example. If I said to you there's a newspaper headline, and this is a real one from the 2002, I think, but I might be wrong, sometime around then. NATO in Libya, catch 22. Every one of you understands broadly what that article is going to say. All of you. But there's a good chunk of the population, a third, who don't have a clue because they don't have the background knowledge in literature, history, politics, economics, etc., in order to bring that the writer has assumed knowledge, and so they're excluded from that community of educated citizens. And if they're excluded at age 16 or 17, they're excluded for life. So I think academic subjects are an entitlement to all pupils, and we should expect them all to join the community of educated citizens. I think it's a democratic question. And if we do that well, then they'll pass exams. They might pass them at a higher or lower level, but they'll do enough to be able to pass what's a fairly low bar of a pass at a GCSE. And we should expect them to be able to do that. That is not saying that somebody who gets an A is necessarily smarter than somebody who gets a 7 or whatever. Like, it's obviously based on the day, but there's a correlation between the passing of exams and some of the purposes that we might talk about with education. And I think that's important. I just want to really come back on Martin's point on sort of criteria reference exams. Of course, these work. They work in music, right? You have music exams that are taken when you're ready and so on, but they don't work everywhere. Like, I can tell you, if you take a history teacher and they set a question, an essay question, when they're marking an essay question, they'll get to like the 6th or 7th script and they'll go back almost always and remark the first one or the second one, because they'll be like, I've just realized this question is much harder than because of the basis of this is assessment theory, right? Because of the basis of the responses, I know it's much harder. So I need to just adjust my kind of level of like how it is. And criteria reference exams, like, it's almost impossible to do that properly in many subjects. It's probably possible to do in mathematics and music, but apart from that, and there's a load of other things I want to say, but I feel like I've dominated the conversation. So
that's sort of the purpose of you being here, though, Stuart.
Let me do one more. Let me ask about memory, because memory has been referred to quite pejoratively, I think, and I just want to defend memory, because here's my definition of learning. If nothing has changed in long-term memory, then nothing has been learnt. I.e., if you're able to perform it in a lesson or in a day, but you forget it long-term, you haven't learnt it. Okay, and that might be a skill, it might be knowledge, it might be whatever it might be. But if nothing has changed in long-term memory, nothing has been learned. That's my definition of learning. It comes from a cognitive scientist, or a set of cognitive scientists, Kirshner, Sweller, and Clark. And I think that if we take that seriously, then we start to like reclaim memory as something actually that we want to be able to make a difference with.
Don't come on here quoting your fancy academics and your memory of what they said.
I hope you two know each other well, and that was.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That was a joke. I mean, it's not memory. Memory is important, but it's I can. There's a difference between being able to remember things. So let me give an example. Some exams for maths and chemistry, you got a formula book. Some you didn't. I didn't need the formula book because I could remember the formulae. That's because I could remember the formulae. That doesn't mean I was necessarily any better at applying them, or understanding what they mean or whatever. But it also meant that I take the point. Being having that thing is important, but it just felt that the way the exams were structured, it's like I could, you could. To within it, reasonably well. If you're doing a question at GCSE on Julius Caesar, you can work out what a lot of the questions are likely to be. and you can pre-prepare the answers.
I agree with this. I agree with this. You can teach the exam. Like you can.
Yeah.
So when you walk into a school and a pupil knows more about how many marks each question is going to be worth than they do about history or geography, then you've got a problem. I agree with that.
Yeah.
And you sort of can't avoid the gaming of the exam to some extent. Like that's fundamentally going to happen. And to be honest, because of the life chances of pupils, like I say to my colleagues, I want you to like prepare kids for exams. We want them to pass exams, right? Just do it for like the last term, not for like the 5 years they're at secondary school. Like teach them the subject, teach them the stuff that's important, teach them to love your subject because you're the expert who's got really into it. Like don't like the exam we can teach them at the end. And I agree with that. That's the imperfect thing of exams. But one thing, if there are parents watching, and this is I think critical, you could, of course can cram for exams. And you can do a bit better by cramming. But if you go onto like the Learning Scientists, or a bunch of cognitive scientists, they have 6 videos on their website who are trying to get them into the heads of how we study in order to learn things long term, to keep it in our long term memory. Because cramming, you forget it the day after the exam or whenever it is. And they have 6 strategies that basically prove cramming isn't a good idea. There's lots of other things you can do instead. And I would really encourage parents to have a look at the Learning Scientists website, just because it would encourage young people to develop really decent study habits that mean that they learn things longer term. So that's something I'll give you.
I'll put that. We'll put that in the show notes and on our social media and so on, which is going across at the bottom now. I've made the banner. I'm going to use it. I think we should move on because we're sort of. I mean,
can we just talk about the political aspect of that, and as us as elected representatives of our community, and how much influence we have over education these days? Because I got into it. Are you going to stop me, David? I'll let you stop.
No, I was going to say on that. Can we take Tara's question?
Yeah.
Can anyone answer why, as parents, if we disagree with Ofsted and Academy, we have no way to complain? Because I think this comes into it.
It's part of the same thing, isn't it? And it's not just as parents and as a community. So my entrance into politics was as a school governor in London like a decade ago, where I was the chair of governors for a school which ended up being outstanding. I think it's still outstanding now. And back in those days, the local authority used to appoint governors, and we used to have parent governors, and we had real influence over the head teacher. So we could, technically fire a head teacher or get a head teacher fired. We definitely got involved in hiring head teachers, and it felt like we were partners in the endeavour. I've talked to Stuart before, and there are lots of excellent academy trusts, but lots of academy trusts to me, and that was back in the local education authority days, where where the councils run all schools before academisation, or most schools when I was the governor. Now these days it feels like that. And not the academy trust, which Stuart is the CEO of, but there are some academy trusts, including some locally, which feel like corporate bodies. Often headquartered a long time ago. We get a constant revolving door of head teachers, and it feels like that local politicians, or even national politicians, and parents and the community have very little say, in the running of the schools, and have. And especially when we have Ofsteds in which there's a huge amount of negative comments from the community, sometimes it feels like those are being disregarded. And it's quite difficult to know how that happens. And for that reason, I mean, I was a big fan of Stuart bringing one of his schools to St Ears because of their reputation. But in general, and at the moment, academies are the only academies and free schools are the only game in town. So it's a big problem, isn't it? Is that we don't have. We're supposed to represent our communities, but we can't really represent the concerns of the community, or both ways.
Do you want me to talk about this? Because I've probably been talking for a long time about it.
Yes. Actually, Stuart, how long do you have? Do you need to go at a particular?
I've booked myself out until 9:30 because I forgot to ask you how long we're supposed to do it for.
Okay, great. So we can go on a bit, because this is fascinating. This is really interesting.
Okay, so I think there's the first thing is education is something provided by the state, and it has to be democratically controlled. I think that's really important. So if I happen to be a Labour Party member, but I think the government has the right to dictate a large amount of what schools do because they represent people that voted them, and they should influence schools significantly. And I think local government has a really important role in this. And I'm going to come back to this in a minute. the first thing on just Tara's question was, why do parents not have an opportunity to complain about an Ofsted inspection to Ofsted? And I think that's an interesting question, because specifically on that question, theoretically, Ofsted is sending expert inspectors into schools to inspect a school with parent view, which is an online survey, considered but not dictating, in order to form a rounded view of the school. Now, I know that, like, I live locally, I know the schools probably that Tara's talking about, like I think anybody who's local probably does, and and I've visited one of the schools and actually tried to help them with their engagement with the community. I don't think successfully, actually, but I think it would be difficult to then say that parents have I'm not sure what we're suggesting. Like, parents no more than an expert Ofsted inspector who's been into the classrooms would feel a bit strange. And I think we have to be like, I think schools should work with their communities and with parents. Like, even when they're doing things that might not be immediately popular with parents, they should work with them. And sometimes, and I've experienced this, like, parents can vehemently disagree with the approach to running schools, and you can't satisfy everybody. I think that's really important to say. And so, and parents can be wrong, of course. There's a reason that that I've got qualifications in terms of running schools, and there's a reason I do professional development and all that sort of stuff, and there's a reason that I'm lucky enough to visit some of the best schools in the country, and so forth. And so, like, we have to be careful around this. I do want to say that in the articles for every multi-academy trust in the country, and I call them school trusts because I think multi-academy trust sounds too corporate now, there has to be parent representation either on the trust board, and the trust board, because it's a charity, is trustees, and they're also directors because it's a company. There has to be representation of parents there, or at the local level, i.e. in each individual school. Now, I know that doesn't necessarily work in the way that Stephen described with local authorities earlier on, but I think that's an important thing to say. Like, it does exist, and it is important. And I recognise the frustrations that might be the case, where it feels like locally there's an overwhelming huge amounts of feedback on an individual school, and then an Ofsted inspection doesn't represent that feedback, and so on. Like, and I can't talk about those because I don't run those schools, right? So I don't know, but I get it. I think fundamentally your question, though, Stephen, is about structures, right? Like, we've moved from a situation in 20 years ago where 23,000 odd schools were run by 320 odd local authorities, and now we're in a situation where 23,000-ish schools are run by 320 local authorities and something like 2,500 school trusts. Like, that's not a sensible system. And it happened because in around 2010 to 2012, the DfE decided to smash the system as we had then. Now, I just want to be clear. I think there are really good reasons for smashing the system back then, right? Like, I worked in a local authority school. I think we had very low expectations, all the excuses under the sun, and we were protected from accountability. I think we served pupils in London incredibly badly. And I think that, and I know that there are local authority schools, or there have been local authority schools that were poor, and I wouldn't have sent my own children to. And I think that there are good reasons. But we lost an awful lot as well. And I mean, it's no surprise. Dominic Cummings was Michael Gove's advisor when they chose to smash the system, and he's something of an anarchist anyway, right? So like it's no surprise. Rebuilding that system, I think, is taking a long time, and no government has really taken it on. So it's sort of just developing and so on. And more than 50% of schools are now taught in academies. I think Labour are planning to square some of the circle around national curriculum and some of the academy freedoms, but nonetheless, like, more than 50% of kids are taught in academies. Like, there's no going back. So I just want to be like I think it's just a kind of dead end to go, like, we're going to reverse those changes. It would be too expensive, governance would be too difficult, so on. You have had, like, if you look at the outlier schools, the kind of schools that have taken us to kind of shown what we can do in terms of pupil achievement, in terms of conduct, and so on, in terms of some of the stuff that's gone on in schools, some of the innovation, you have had schools that have run incredibly differently and taught the sector And so we have like the best schools are better than they were 20 years ago, like and so on. But you have had very like egregious examples of schools being run incredibly badly, as you know, under school trusts. And I don't want to claim that there is any significant evidence that schools do better as academies than they do under local authorities. Actually, like, it's really hard to unpick the evidence, but we think there's probably minimal difference. So that I think any claims around that are not really worth the paper they're written on. But I do want to labour this point about local government, because I think this is important, and I'm really influenced by Leora Cruddas. Leora Cruddas was Director of Education at Waltham Forest a few years ago. She's now the CEO of the Confederation of School Trusts, the sector body for multi-academy trusts, and she thinks that we need to be like she's influenced me on this significantly. And just to be clear, like, I used to be involved in and a member of the Anti-Academies Alliance, and I'm now running an academy trust. So like I have changed my position quite significantly. I think local government has an important role in education as the democratically elected authority. The problem is that we conflate two rather separate entities of local government, the political function and the administrative function. And lots of things are claimed about, like, the middle tier, i.e. not the DfE and not schools and so on. But actually, there isn't really a thing. There's a very small set of actual statutory responsibilities local government has with regard to education, mostly, but not exclusively, in the kind of protective space, which I'll talk about a bit more. Most of what people mean by the middle tier has no statutory basis. Local government does have huge strategic, and I'm talking to you who know far more about this than me, so like, correct me where I'm wrong, but local government does have huge strategic capacity and capability, and I think they could use this well to support the local education system. In many cases, it doesn't happen. So I guess we talk quite often about local education partnerships, and there were things being claimed about these partnerships and so on, but only local government has the authority to convene in place. Like, outsourced or spun out, usually commercial school improvement services don't. They don't have the governance, they don't have the legitimacy to do that. But I struggle to understand, if we were developing a system from scratch, why on earth local government, with all its legitimacy, power and authority, would want to be a provider of schools among other providers. It's a bizarre position, if you think about it, to hold on to. There are much more important roles for local government than providing schools, in my view. And so in an emerging set of relationships, the role of local government is absolutely essential. But here's the three things I think that are specific. Do you want to interrupt me? I'm fine to.
I don't disagree with that, with local authorities necessarily providing schools, and I think that's been the case in Cambridgeshire probably for 20 years.
It has, yeah.
But I do think there's a role, and this might be what you're coming to, in terms of accountability with schools. And there's also the strategic thing about making sure you've got schools for every child and that sort of stuff as well. But it's the strategic side of accountability sometimes where I think local authorities could play a role. And in some ways, it would be one of the ways of countering the this parent voice, which sometimes does get out of control on social media and stuff like that.
So actually, I'm not sure I have very firm views on this, because local authorities do play a role. They have to report on their estates. They report to the DfE about how good their schools are, regardless of whether they're academies or not. And so that's an important thing for us to just pause on. And I just want us to be careful around saying that accountability, we've talked about Ofsted earlier on, like where does accountability for the quality of schools sit, and who independently is assessing that? I think it's essential, but it needs to be joined up. So I don't have a very firm view, because I think I guess my suggestion is we need to think about it a lot, and if we think about it a lot, it'll probably be okay, and if we don't think about it and knee jerk, it probably won't be. I think that's probably the rule of most things, right? Here's the three roles I think are for local government that are important: protector, convener and supporter. So protector, local government will always, in my view, have a protective function in relation to the most vulnerable children and young people. They have statutory duties in relation to safeguarding and children's social care. They've got to enact their duties as a corporate parent. They'll undoubtedly continue, even if we had a fully academised system, to have duties with regard to children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities. They've got to have a role in elective home education, children missing education, unaccompanied children, refugees, like really important. So the protector role's like critical. Convener, I think it has a very important convening function in relation to kind of strategic objectives for education, the shaping of place. So local areas are good places for children to grow up. It's important local government has a convening role in the creation of social value and the promotion of public values. And it has a sufficiency duty, right? It's got to dictate on places and so on, as Stephen and I have talked about when we tried to open a school in St Neots. Only the local authority holds all the information required to calculate how many school places are needed. A supporter, I think, and this is one where I think it's the role of schools has changed very significantly in my career. I've been teaching since the late 90s. And schools, the volume of things that schools are responsible for has expanded. It feels like exponentially, but maybe it isn't, as particularly as other services have declined or been decimated. So I think local government has significant strategic capability and capacity. So it's able to work with education providers to help overcome barriers, promote education as a social good. An example would be the role of local government in supporting and, as a last result, enforcing school attendance. I can't fine parents for not attending schools, but I have to go to the local authority to do so. And that's a whole nother question about whether that's right or not. Another example would be to support the supply of teachers, particularly in areas where there's a local system level problem. During the pandemic, and I think this is one of the lessons we haven't kept well enough from the pandemic, we saw local authorities working with school trusts to enact civic leadership. Like, it was actually phenomenally good. I don't understand why we haven't kept hold of that. Addressing issues of public concern and place, and that's the critical bit for local government for me, and the protection and promotion of public values. And I think like that relationship, like that stuff that local government could really focus on, that feels to me like to be very strategically important. And then to say like, but we want to also run schools, like it just feels a bit funny, like as I said earlier. So that's where I stand.
But I think the role that I'd like to see is much less than that, and it goes back to the old school governor days when we were seen as critical friends, which is that's a great description, a great role to play, is that we are friends of the school, but we're going to call them out when things go wrong, and that's, I mean, to be fair to the Academy Trust, we're not naming for some reason, the local Academy Trust, they have allowed us in the door. I can have meetings with the CEO almost any time that I choose to, but that wider community role where the community had a voice, and again, governing bodies still exist, but to my view, they're much diminished, and they have much less influence. And we had on social media this week, we had a weird situation where a former governor, or was recently retired governor of that school, was criticizing the local authority for not doing more, and the local politicians like, you're a school governor, you should be there doing it. And so you get the impression that quite often the governors won't put their head above the parapet because of the amount of, that's a social media problem, I guess. But giving the community a proper voice in schools, which means that all aspects of the community, not just parents and not just politicians, having community leaders involved as well, as it used to be. I think that is the critical thing for me that's missing from the local Academy Trust, and I suspect from lots of them.
But so I take that. I think there's probably something in that. I just would like to balance that with, but people can be wrong. Do you know what I mean? Particularly inexpert people can be wrong, and you can't satisfy everybody, and so that's really important.
I think it's one of the most important things you said today, Stuart, is the point of, and it's an issue I always go back to, but inexpert people can be wrong. It's not something that just applies to education, and it's something that councillors get caught up in a lot in, as a whole and as an entity, because they're sort of they sit between the people and the experts. Effectively, and it's the planning system is another one where because 200 residents say something shouldn't happen, they think they're the expert, but actually the expert voice is analysing those comments and those concerns, but using their expertise and their knowledge alongside the facts about the situation. And a lot of that, I think, is very similar to what schools face sometimes with residents. Over things like behaviour and achievement.
And I just want to say, like, Stephen's right that we risk losing something that might have been positive before. I think there's and I don't want to claim that all school trusts do the right thing. I think there's a case where school trusts, and I may be talking, like, I'm going to let people draw their own conclusions, but I may be talking, this might apply to more local school trusts that we're talking about, do the right thing, but could be supported in the manner in which they do it. Do you know what I mean? Like, and I think we could risk losing some of that. I think that I would agree with that. I don't know if that's, I'm trying not to be cryptic, but also like I think it's kind of inappropriate to talk about an individual school without somebody here to both defend and add flavor. So yeah.
But I think to just make a general comment, I think from my experience engaging in different situations with parents who are critical towards a certain aspect, whether it was behavior or like other aspect of the school running, I think often when you discuss the detail of it, it's less so about the detail or like what specific thing is implemented, it's more about, you know, this issue around like feeling you don't have accountability or feeling your views weren't listened to or feeling you don't have a way to represent your views. Of course, some cases I do accept it's about a disagreement with specific policy and that, you know, like can be navigated, but it's more difficult. But I think in general, like a lot of the cases are around, well, you know, like I feel my views, let's say as a parent, are not, you know, engaged with, or I feel I don't get anywhere if I was to make a complaint, for example. So I think there's a piece around communications and accountability and a different kind of set of circumstances where you generally have a disagreement on policy.
I agree 100%, and I'm not immune to this, right? So we've set up a school in our organization a couple of years ago. It's very close to the site where another school was closed down, run by a school trust, right? So it's closed down, extremely poor standards, one of the worst schools in the country. So we set up a brand new school not very far away, and that, like, just the job of like raising expectations both in the community and so on has led to us having significant, like, difficult conversations and conflict with community members, like parents, etc., trying to like show what is possible, because there's just no experience of it. And like, how do you do that in terms of like listening to people? How do you show you're listening? Like, it's really challenging. Like, and I don't think we've got everything right in my organization. I don't want to claim we're perfect by any means. Like, without question, very, very difficult, and something like showing that people are included in like that idea of place. Like, this is like, a school is not run by me, it's run by my charity for the community in the area. Like, if I go, somebody else will replace me. Like, it's not about the individuals. And I think that goes to the heart of what you're saying, Alex. Like, it's the part of like, how do you show that you, and what Stephen was saying, how do you show that the community, the users, the people that actually should benefit from the existence of a school also feel like they're the people who are central to it? I think that's critical. Yeah.
I'd kind of like to move on, if I may, to, we've got some of the things we were going to talk about. One of which is discipline standards. Sort of discipline in schools, because you seem to have a range from, I don't know, I mean, I suppose this is a philosophical things, to you know, do what you want whenever you want, to Catherine Birbalsingh, and so on. I suppose it'd be interesting, Stuart, as you know, you've got the career and you've got the expertise and so on. Discipline in schools, eh?
So
I should say, I know that Stuart has thoughts about this, which is why.
So one of the roles that I've been fortunate enough to do, and I've done alongside my role, is I'm one of the national behaviour advisors for the DfE, although I don't know the status of that longer term with the change in government. And so I've been lucky enough to visit schools that are very good, and I've been lucky enough to support schools that want to improve in terms of discipline. I want to say a couple of things. Firstly, like, behaviour in schools is better than it was 20 years ago, without question. Like, you don't hear the same kind of egregious things you heard 20 years ago as standard, people throwing chairs, etc. But that doesn't mean that they don't exist. But standards of discipline and conduct, I think, are overall poor. And I think in the average school in this country, I think most parents would be shocked. And I think this is important to say. You cannot learn anything if your lesson is disrupted, not just by like the most egregious examples, but by people's not paying attention, or looking out the window, or very small things like a lack of equipment or whatever it might be. Like, it doesn't just disrupt the individual, it takes lesson time away from everybody, and that's the one thing we can never get back is time. And so that's super important. Like the couple of things about, like, you can't teach unless behavior is very good, I just think is a kind of truism. Now, the other thing is, I do believe kids can behave. Like I don't think there is a like there's very few kids who like find it impossible to like follow instructions and so on. Like I just think that's also true, and it's my experience, but it depends on your expectations of them. I think I talked about Sir Michael Wilshaw as the head of Ofsted earlier, but one of the things he did when he moved to Mossbourne Academy in Hackney is he went and said, on the site of Hackney Downs School, a really tough school with a troubled history, he said, this new school, we're going to show that poor kids can behave. And it was eye-opening. I was working in a school in another London borough. It was eye-opening. Like at that school, kids all do what they're told. Every teacher can teach for 100% of the time, etc., etc. There are some things Michael Wilshaw did that I wouldn't replicate, but in some ways, and the achievement of those poor kids in Hackney outstripped anything we'd seen before. Like it had parents queuing to get, you couldn't get enough people in the door. It was just a transformed school. That was a lesson to the sector, saying we can expect more of our young people, I think, and I think that's important for us to say.
From my perspective, this is quite an important. My son is a teacher. My son teaches history, and he did teach in a number of Peterborough schools, but he got one of the reasons he ended up teaching abroad was because he was struggling with discipline policies within schools that meant it was increasingly difficult for him to teach. Is the reality, and he loves what he does, and my son is really passionate about history and about teaching, and he loves teaching abroad in the schools he does, partly because the behaviour thing compared to what he dealt with in the UK is amazing. And it is it's the thing for me about schools is you set the expectations and you set the standards and the way those standards are enforced, and then you have to be utterly consistent in the way you apply them, because otherwise parents exploit it basically, and children too.
So I agree with that. So just to say firstly, the responsibility for behaviour in a school is the responsibility of the leader of the school, usually the head teacher. I think that's the case. I don't think you can leave it to individual teachers to develop their own strategies. You have to have a system that's consistent across the school 100% of the time. And if adults don't design that system, don't design the expectations, if they're not explicit about it, if schools don't have rules that they defend, then the expectations will be set by the pupils. And they won't be set by the pupils who are sitting getting on with their work. In the best case scenario, they're set by the class clown. In the worst case scenario, they're set by the bullies. And that's just and your testimony, Martin, actually speaks to one of the things I think is critical. We have a retention crisis in teachers in this country. I don't think it's a recruitment crisis, it's a retention crisis. Too many teachers leave the profession, and you look at the National Workload Survey, it's generally because of behaviour and work, actually, overwork, doing nonsense things in schools, which are closely related. If you've got to phone 10 parents at the end of every day and keep them behind for detention and so on and so forth, then you've got a very significant issue. But I do think there's another thing. I'm in favour of schools being strict, very strict, in fact. But I think there are two things to say, and some people talk about being warm strict. I think we forget it. It's easy to forget the warm. You're allowed to smile at kids. You're allowed to be happy they're there. You're allowed to you're allowed to go this is fascinating. I can't wait to share it with you. You're allowed to care about them and so on. The warm bit. And then the second thing, back to really strict and so on, defend your rules, and so on. But the second thing is, and it's related, is purpose, not power. So every rule you have should have a purpose behind it, and you should be able to explain that purpose, including, if I'm honest, in my secondary schools, kids can't go why to whatever they're asked at the time, because it just disrupts whatever. Like, you do as you're told, and if you think it's unfair, there's a time when you come and ask, like, why did that happen, and so on, because you have to run a school productively for the benefit of hundreds of pupils, not for one or two. And quite often I get accused, no, that's not true, actually, I don't anymore, but I used to get accused of being a kind of zero tolerance head teacher. Like, I don't agree. I don't think anyone, almost nobody, calls themselves zero tolerance, and this is for this reason. We teach young people, we're privileged to teach young people. Like, young people make mistakes, we tolerate those mistakes, but we must make sure they learn from them. If you have a rule and a young person doesn't meet the rule, you must have a consequence. Like, it can be minor, but there needs to be certainty of consequence. Otherwise, it's not a rule anymore. Like, in action, it's like acceptable. And so either get rid of the rule or enforce the rule has to be the position in a school, and it has to be enforced 100% of the time, and leaders have to take responsibility for making sure that's the case. And I just think that the correlation, if you look at the top 100 schools in the country for achievement, all of them have great behavior, like almost without exception, all of them. That's not a coincidence. And if you look at the bottom 100 schools, I haven't been to visit them, but I would hazard a guess that they're close to dangerous places to teach in, or like they're improving and so on. Like I think behavior and achievement are very closely correlated, and of course it's correlated with safety and how you feel safe.
There's something though. Is there a balance? Well, there is a sort of. It's almost contradicting myself as well. But one of the things that concerns me a little bit about schools is, and part of this to me is the focus on and I use this phrase quite a lot, and I'm sure you'll challenge it, but on schools being exam factories. And there's a thing for me about the fact that, you know, we should never forget that these are young people, and actually they're entitled to fun. And schools, some schools, not all, are losing that sense of how to make sure that children have fun within that environment and that framework that, you know, you talked about.
Yeah, it's kind of like, so yeah, I probably wouldn't describe it. So, like, I think fun's a really interesting word. You certainly can run a school as an exam factory. You definitely can. Like, and kids leave with great exam results. And like, I'd rather my child went to a school like that than went to one that was some of the poorest schools in the country. So that's the first thing to say. Like, importantly, like, if I sent my child to what you would describe as an exam factory, like, I wouldn't be that upset about it, is the first thing, because at least they're safe and they're going to know some stuff when they leave. But I accept I accept that's not there's something to be balanced. We try very hard. We don't manage it, but we try very hard to work with families to make sure every child that comes to our secondary school climbs Snowdon, and every primary school child has a meaningful residential experience. Like, we do that because we think there's something else to be gained by that. I think that my secondary school in Bedford might be the only state school in the country where 100% of pupils play for a school team, and we don't care if we don't win. Like 100% of pupils, like, it's an expectation. And there are some things about, like, enjoyment. This is sort of about the purpose of education, right? So like, I think the subjects that we teach are in themselves fascinating, fun, and enjoyable.
Agreed.
But they might not be when you're learning them. Like, maths is a difficult subject to teach and learn, right? The enjoyment comes from being good at maths. You start to get, like, and success breeds success. And so sometimes you have, like, and I think this is a function of schools, you have to do the boring things, right? Like, I don't think we should teach kids to be good at creating videos on YouTube, because that's probably quite fun to do in their own time anyway. We've got to teach them the stuff they kind of wouldn't do in their own time otherwise. Otherwise, we trap them in the domain of their experience. And we know that for more advantaged families, that's probably okay. But for less advantaged families, typically it might not be. And so I think we need to be careful around that. And we should be exposing them to stuff that they wouldn't encounter otherwise. And academic subjects are some of those. So I often say, like, let's talk about the purpose of teaching art in schools. Like, what's the purpose of teaching art? And people have different answers to this. But one of my answers about the purpose of teaching art is, like, if somebody says to me to get a good GCSE, I'd be like, well, what about the 3/4 of people who don't take a GCSE in it? What are they getting out of studying art at school? And here's what I think the answer is. a part of, you go to an art gallery and you enjoy it. Because if you're not inducted into art, like there's so many adults who find it incredibly boring because they have no background knowledge to relate to, or they have to read the blurb because they have no, like, do you know what I mean? Like, well, if we've taught them well and inducted them into the discipline of art history, like they might enjoy art galleries. Or how many disadvantaged kids enjoy opera? Probably very few. So part of our music curriculum should be to teach the background knowledge that people that enjoy opera or experiences enjoy opera relate to in order to enjoy opera, or whatever it might be. That's where I think fun comes into it. It's not just about the kids being kids. It's like sometimes the way I phrase it is sometimes people say it's not just about the academics, it's about the whole child. And I'm like, it's not just about the whole child, it's about the whole child's life. Like it's about preparing them for enjoyment through adulthood as well, an interest they wouldn't otherwise have encountered unless we expose them to it.
It's important to make that there's a lesson and a thing for this. I have absolutely no artistic talent whatsoever. I promise you that is true. I mean, even that thing behind me that I don't play often enough, part of that's practice. But when I did my Open University degree, we did art history as part of the foundation for it. And and it taught me something about art appreciation, and I have to say, it's a lesson learned that reinforces what you said, that actually, at least I can, if I go into an art gallery, I can look and appreciate certain things sort of within there. So things about how light plays on a subject was one of the things that we were taught, and how that helps you to provide your focus on what a painting is about.
But also related to your question of your son, like if you've got a grounding in kind of chronology of history and so on, like applying that to like the pieces that dictate, like if you go to the National Portrait Gallery and have a good understanding of history, you're likely to enjoy it. Like, and so that's what I mean about joining the community of educated citizens.
But it's also true for all of us as politicians that history is absolutely vital, because one of my criticisms of politicians is that they don't learn the lessons of the past, and so in order to learn their lessons of the past, you have to understand the past.
Can I just say on the arts as well? I think it's really interesting argument around, like, especially how can we support people who are from less advantaged backgrounds in many ways, because if you don't do this in school, and if it's like seen as competitive, like for example in my school, and I won't give you all the shocking examples of discipline that would be shocking in this context in the Romanian schools, but it was like very kind of strict, like, so in the classroom it was like, super quiet, like, there were some very bad examples as well, but if, for example, when you did maths in the like kind of like highly controlled environment, even if you're like bad at it, right, like you still did it, you're still in the class, you still like did learn something, but then you couldn't do like any of the other, like some of the other options. For example, Stuart was saying about how everyone in one of his schools plays in the team, because if I was bad already at everything, like in the initial test, right, you couldn't like join a team or like go and do like football or whatever, because, or couldn't join the choir because I didn't have a singing voice, right? So you're kind of like already excluded, and this means that if you didn't do those things at home, if your parents didn't go to anything that was linked to, I don't know, like art or like culture, then you didn't have that experience either. So like, yes, now going for the first time as a parliamentary candidate to the like opera in London was a really strange experience, I have to say. I did enjoy it, but if you don't have that background, it's actually, as you're saying, like very difficult. So I
would argue you should teach operatic metal rather than opera.
Well,
you just want everybody to have to listen to Nightwish, don't you, Martin?
Well, I'm not a fan of operatic metal either, though, by the way. Yeah,
right. Okay, Martin, you're off the show.
Every Birmingham school should learn the history of Black Sabbath.
I agree with that. My knowledge on mainly Metallica has been self-taught, but like on this point about, like, I think just to come back to the point around discipline and standards, I think you can also end up in the context like I experienced, where you have like very like strict and like respected discipline in the classroom, but then you also, it's very difficult to control outside the classroom. So for example, like in the breaks and like in the wider child's life, and it's exactly what I experienced. And it was like, terrible, like in some terms of some of the things that happened in school in the break or outside, or like things that weren't really monitored or safeguarding issues, but whilst you're in the classroom was like really strictly enforced. So I think that can also happen, to have a mix of like, oh, everything looks good on paper, but what happens outside that formal classroom time is actually quite shocking.
Yeah, I agree. We've got to teach the standards of, like, the expectations of civilized society and expect them in our schools. Sorry, I interrupted somebody.
Stephen, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, can I ask a question about discipline as well? So one of the curious things locally about the issue we have with the local academy trust is largely in the parents' views, or the most vocal parents' views, is to do with their discipline standards, yeah, which are widely pushed, well, at least in the vocal social media group, are pushed back against. But if you talk to the other purveyors of excellent or outstanding education in the area, including you, Stuart, including the Cam Academy Trust, I don't think the discipline standards are very different. Yeah, you might disagree with that, but I think in the past you've looked into it, and I think lots of things they're trying to do are the ways that education professionals like yourselves would say are the best way to get a school from being requires improvement to outstanding. You have to get that sorted out, but there also doesn't seem to be. So I think the problem with the local schools is the communication, how those standards were implemented, the timescale in which they were implemented, and kind of that like you said, that there's not been enough why in the conversation, so people just see the standards and see them as being too strict. But it also doesn't seem to be much diversity in that as well. And it seems like, if you went back, well, it seems to be stricter now than when I was at school, and I went to school a very long time ago. And I wondered if, like, we've all kind of fixed in on a single solution, and it might not be the best solution. Sorry, there's a lot in that.
The first thing is, like I suspect that people have done what they know to be the right thing that works, and done it very quickly, and haven't necessarily brought people with them. I think Bananarama said, like, ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it, right? So, like, I think that's like,
that's what it's all about.
Exactly, right? And so like I think they will know that there's some work to do with local communities and so on, and you've been much more heavily involved there, Stephen, than I have. In terms of diversity, like, I think it's a good question. Like, there was the narrative of when Michael Gove was Secretary of State, the narrative was about school choice, right? Like, if you don't like the school, you can go to the school down the road and approach something differently. And that's fine in a big city like London, where you can just, like, where there's multiple schools. It's fine if there are vacancies in the schools. It's probably more difficult in St Neots, where we're talking about, or in, like, rural areas where you've got, like, one school that kids can go to. And so I think that's vital. I think there's like, what do I say? I think that educators generally and school leaders should embrace that we are uncertain about almost everything in schools. This is going to be harsh for parents to hear, right? But what I mean by that is that, aside from teaching phonics as the method of decoding when pupils are very young, research basically is, like, inconclusive on almost everything in education. So we have to implement like we're certain, but also be open to being wrong or there being a better way. And I think that's vital. I would argue that I think that's the case. I mean, I was shocked to find that's also the case in health, and the case in like how to go about fighting fires, and so, like, there are different approaches that and so forth. But I think that we need to be explicit about this. I just would be like, I think there are different ways of implementing. I would struggle to. I don't think you'll find any school that runs really well without very high expectations of pupil conduct. Like, how you do that is might be a different question. But I would go back to, like, I might not know the perfect way of implementing systems and procedures to establish excellent pupil conduct, but I would say that if you don't have expectations of excellent pupil conduct, you're probably not running a brilliant school.
Can I add to that, though, that there's something else that, I mean, this is me as a One Nationist as well, and I believe that fundamental to everything in terms of achieving what you want to achieve as a One Nationist is aspiration and self-belief. And it's is some of what schools having to do, and outside of the strict education and the teaching of, for want of a better expression, facts. It's, to me, having a child leave school, and every child should leave school with a ladder of achievement in front of them that they believe they can climb. And is that something that schools fail at as well? To me, it's the two things that separate the excellent from the good, if you want, is getting discipline right and getting that sense of aspiration right with young people.
Yeah, I think it's a much more difficult question where I don't have a very easy answer to it. The first thing is, like, you can't have aspiration without expectation, I don't think. So, like, if you've got a primary school and you don't expect pupils to reach expected standard in reading, writing and mathematics, like the clues in the name, expected standard, right? We should be expecting that standard in order for pupils to access secondary. If you have a secondary school and you're not expecting pupils to be able to access university, like, and I'm not saying they have to go, I think that's a different debate, but like, you're not expecting pupils to reach a standard where they can access university, then you're probably I would argue the expectations are probably too low, accepting there are exceptions and so on, but they should be exceptions. And the reason I say that is because we're an education institution. We should be proud of like pupils moving on to study more and so on. I think that's a thing. And the second thing is, and this is critical, for most people, for their own kids, they expect expected standard and they expect kids to have the option of going to university for their own kids. And if that's the case for your own kids, it should be the case for the schools I run as well, right? Like, it shouldn't be that other people's kids have different expectations to mine. And I think that's a really important thing to say. On aspiration, though, I find this really difficult. I find schools correctly talk about raising aspiration of pupils, particularly pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds. And you have to confront them with the Millennium Cohort Study. I think this is a study of mothers of young people who were born in the year 2000. Now, I have the figures wrong, so I know this is going out public, and so somebody will be saying this is wrong. But like, I'll tell you my recollection. At the point that those pupils were born, 99% of mothers wanted those young children, those kids, to go to university. Right, 99%. Right? That's not a lack of aspiration, right? That includes disadvantaged families and so on. By the time they got to another age, which I can't remember, they resurveyed the same mothers and it had reduced to, I don't know, let's say it's 60% or whatever, but it reduced. So aspiration had been kind of battered out of them. Like, perhaps because they've come across like education's harder or something's harder or whatever, but nonetheless, like, those families didn't start when the children were born with a lack of aspiration for the young people. And so I think our job in schools, we should reframe it to meet the aspirations that parents have for their children when they're born. That's what we should be aiming to do.
Okay. Yeah.
Having said that, how we do that, I think we're inexpert in that, and we need to, like, I think it requires very significant thought. I mean, like, I've come across, there's a academy trust I'm very influenced by up north, because I think they're brilliant at what they do, and they have their induction day in a university. Like, they don't bring them to school, their induction day is in a university. This is what we're aiming for. I think it's in Leeds University. Like, this is what we're aiming for. This is, like, we're exposing you to it. And I've got some time for that. I was a disadvantaged child. I guess I'd be labeled as a disadvantaged child. As a child, my first experience of university was when I'd passed the Oxford entrance exam, which I was made to do, turned up for interview, and I was in this big room with 3 professors, and I went completely blank for however long the interview was, like completely intimidated. So I've got some time for that kind of thing. But how we do it, like, I think we're inexpert on, and we probably need to refocus on. So this is a kind of admission that it might be something I need to think about some more.
I'd like to take a question from Daniela. Maybe an unpopular opinion, but if a school has a flock of teachers leaving in a very short period, something is fundamentally wrong in leadership or in the general system. There's far too many schools all over the country having this problem to blame it on individual head teachers. It is something I'm aware of from other places where I'm going to take the question down because it's covering Martin and Stuart. But I have seen that in places. Where, I should say, I should probably preface this by saying my mum's a teacher, and my uncle, her brother, was a teacher and is now an inspector for Estin. But that does happen. Is that a leadership thing? Is that a systemic thing? Because that seems quite striking when suddenly lots of teachers want to leave a school all at once.
Yeah, I'm not quite clear on the question, because it said it's got to be a problem of leadership, but you can't blame head teachers. And head teachers are an important part of leadership, probably the most critical part of leadership of a school. So we have a retention crisis in this country. I think that's a problem of leadership of schools, full stop, like as in political leadership and individual leadership. I think schools could be, as I say, significantly better. If a lot of teachers are leaving a school, that may be an indicator that there is a problem with leadership, of course. Like, it might be an indicator of something else as well, but I don't know. And you probably need to take a wider view. I was very happy last summer when I kind of reflected with my trust board, and I was like, look at our retention figures, they're incredibly high, we're fully staffed. It's really unusual in this country in the current climate. Like everyone who's left has left either for promotion or a relocation. Like we kind of felt very, very positive about our schools. But like I was also like, it's 1 year, like it could just be a blip. Do you know what I mean? You've got to be really careful, and it could be a blip the other way as well. So you've got to but it's a source of information. And the premise of the question, like, if there's rapid turnover of staff in a school, there's probably a problem. I agree. But I also want to say, if there's zero turnover of staff, there might be a problem as well. It might be too comfortable. It might not be serving the pupils well enough. It might, like, all that sort of stuff. It might be that teachers aren't developing significantly in order to move to promoted positions and so on. So, like, it's a source of information. I agree with the premise of the question. Like, I agree that if you have 20% of a teaching staff leave a school, you probably should be asking some very serious questions to that school.
But is it possible that there's a flip side to this, which is that actually, if you've got a school that is in desperate need of change, you bring in a leader that is making that change happen for the good, that you will actually, there are some teachers that won't like that, and it will create the same environment where teachers leave, and that might be a good thing.
Of course, everyone hates change, right? Like, and so change it's a really difficult thing to manage. It's a leadership problem and so on. So I sort of agree. And there are academy trusts that take on broken schools, and I use that phrase, replace the head teacher, replace the leadership team, replace any teachers who don't want to get on board the bus, and kind of the school is run better. And don't get me wrong, I would rather send my children to the school after the Academy Trust has taken over than before. Of course I would. But we also need to be careful around this, right? Because many of those colleagues might leave the profession completely. And I work in education. Even if somebody is not very good at their job, I think you can teach people to be better. Right? I think if somebody doesn't know enough, I think you can teach them to know more. And so I think our default model of turning a school from a poorer school to a better school should be about, like, what can we do to make sure that leaders know more, are able to implement better, have better systems, which you can definitely translate, and are able to, like, engage the parents and community in order to implement them. Really, I think our focus on implementation rather than with the what has to be really important. That's back to the Bananarama thing I said. But the implementation are able to implement better. And of course, at some point, like, if one of my head teachers, for example, is doing a very poor job, I've got to act in the best interest of pupils. That's why we exist, right? We don't exist for the interest of staff, and very importantly. And of course, it's the case that if you've got people who you know are doing a bad job and are going to continue to do a bad job, every second they're in post longer than you need them to be, like, is a second too long, and you've let down the pupils. But I think in general, people can get better at their jobs, and the final thing is also people can look like they're not very good at their job, and then you put in, like, different systems, or like you manage their workload, or you support them, and suddenly you find actually they're much better than I thought they were, because actually they were constrained by the systems around them. And I just think we have to have less of a deficit model when talking about schools that can be significantly better, and more of a kind of what is possible model, I think.
Sorry,
and Martin says it's not Bananarama, it's Fun Boy 3. Fine, like, whatever. Sorry.
So you say a deficit model. You mean, does that just mean you're looking at what the problems are and focusing on that rather than on where you can push things up?
Yeah, like very typically, you might be like, a head teacher has led a school to like poor results, like a not very good Ofsted inspection, so we need to get rid of them because these are all the things they've done wrong. Whereas no, what could we turn, like, how could we develop the head teacher to lead the school really well? Like, is a
Right.
much more difficult, but I think more sustainable question, particularly in an era where we just don't have enough teachers or school leaders. Like, not enough people want to do the job.
I agree. You know, you could have a situation where an Ofsted report comes partly, you know, a poor Ofsted report of whatever sort, partly because you've got a head teacher that's trying to lead and is trying to do the right thing, but is not necessarily A, skilled enough to do it, or B, is you know, is facing difficulty with some of the teachers. And actually, if you can teach them to overcome that, is a win-win, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree.
But now that Stephen has gone to work, I think there's like an echo on my side, or if everyone can hear it. Yeah,
Oh,
I don't know.
there does seem to be an echo.
Yeah, a bit of a echo.
Oh dear.
Yeah.
I'm not sure where that's come from.
It's on your side.
See, the only one I'm struggling with hearing is Alex, but yeah. Well, I can move on to the question I think Alex is going to ask if that makes it easier. But I think one of the things we've struggled with eternally in Cambridgeshire, and I go back, I'm old, so I go back a long way. And one of the things I remember is 1997, that headlines with Tony Blair's face on the front of the Cambridge News, saying basically that he would sort out the education funding situation in Cambridgeshire, you know, which was dire then and is pretty dire now, you know, comparatively. And part of it, Cambridgeshire suffers from success to a certain extent, so the imperative to sort it isn't there. But actually, I still believe the students in Cambridgeshire suffer from having a relatively unbalanced core education funding situation. And I just wondered where you were with this, Stuart.
So I was a head teacher in Cambridgeshire. Oh, I'm echoing as well. So I think somebody's not muted. So I was a head teacher in Cambridgeshire, and I remember the MP for the school I was head teacher at Cottenham Village College was Heidi Allen. That feels like a long time ago that Heidi Allen was an MP, right? And I remember her saying, like, what's the issue? And the issue was around there was no national funding formula, so it was very, very disparate. Arrangements for funding were very different. If you're in a different postcode, pupils are funded at different rates. And she took me to the DFE to talk to Sam Giamma, who also isn't around anymore, who is in the department. And we made the case. I made the case for at the time, I think I'm doing all the things that the department want us to do in this school, and yet we're hamstrung by unfair funding. And I think that's true. There is a national funding formula now. Every pupil is funded to a minimum level, and the national funding formula, although we haven't reached it, every local authority has to move towards it by at least 10% every year. So that exists. So the unfairness that you describe is either fixed or going to be fixed in terms of that. So I think that's important to say. I think that we should put the pressure on. There's also the requirement that funding is the same. So just to be clear, funding is exactly the same for academies as it is for local authority schools. There's no difference in that. There's no and just to be clear about some myths that often come about, school trusts can't make a profit, no director is ever paid, all that sort of stuff. There's no while we're companies, we're not allowed to make a profit. That's the law. So so there is a national funding formula. I don't think that's so. And to be clear, I think that for the amount of taxpayers' money that is spent on schools, taxpayers should be able to expect better than we get on average. I do. I think that. Okay, and that's, as a Labour supporter, quite a weird thing to be saying. I of course think we could do more with more money, but I think schools are funded in general well enough to do better than we do now. I think there are some if we're talking about distribution, I think there are a couple of things where we need to distribute differently. First is, I think special schools need consideration of their funding much more explicitly. They have a higher proportion of members of staff who are not teachers, and so they're differently affected by pay, and I think we need to take a different look at that, and I would put a lot of pressure locally and nationally on looking at what we can do around special schools. And I think primary schools, particularly small primary schools, are really under threat. If I'm honest, very small primary schools pretty much unviable unless we get something different around that. And so if we value small primary schools, village primary schools, we should look at that. But also primary schools generally, I think, have far less headroom than secondary schools. And so I think that just considering those things, I think, are important. The critical bit on funding, and just to be clear, like the national funding formula says at the moment, a primary school pupil is worth £3,562. Pupil in years 7 to 9 is worth £5,022, and in years 10 and 11, £5,661. Sixth form is a different world. You add on deprivation factors and so on, so the minimum you can get at primary per pupil is £4,610, and the minimum at secondary is £5,995. Like, plus each school gets a lump sum of £134,000. Like, that's how we're funded, every school in the country, minimum standards right now. Where I think funding is a mess, and where I think things are broken, and a thing we probably can't get into to a great extent, is SEND, and it's a real mess. I think the incentives are all wrong, and I think that I think fixing it is a kind of 10-year project, which is going to take some brave leadership at political level to sort out. If you're a parent of a pupil who's struggling in school and you're not quite sure why, you're heavily incentivized to get them labelled as SEND and to get an education, health and care plan. You're incentivized by that because that comes with money attached that gets spent on your child. And as a parent, why would you not want money spent on your child? The issue with that, well, there's a big issue around the labelling, which I'm going to try and address. But like, that's incentivized, then you get it recognised. That money is then spent on a child. In some schools, that means you're taken out of English lessons to be read to by somebody who's not qualified in the corridor, like, and that person's then paid out of that money. Like, you can imagine, like, that probably isn't as like what you're anticipating the effect being, is that you get a less qualified person teaching you. But that's the kind of thing that ends up happening as a result of like the kind of broken system. But worse in funding terms, because it's a funding question, the first £6,000 of the expenditure in EHCP comes from the school's budget, which is more than the school gets for the pupil. So schools are disincentivized to take pupils of EHCPs financially because they have to spend £6,000 on each EHCP automatically. Notionally, 10% of schools' funding is for that money. But if you don't have any HCPs, you don't lose that 10%. Like that 10%, like, so there's no kind of like enforcement. And if you have too many, you don't go, oh, don't like. And there are some local things that Schools Forum, which is as you will know, is the local funding mechanisms, and it gets very technical, can do about that. But the whole thing about SEND is there's incentivization to label pupils as SEND, and then there's disincentive to take the pupils who have been labelled as SEND. And then you get to, and I think this is right, an EHCP might say this pupil needs X, Y, and Z, and a school might rightly say, we cannot do Z, like we physically can't do Z, like it's impossible to do without unacceptably damaging the education of pupils, other pupils in the school, like we can't. Now an EHCP is a legal guarantee to the parent. So the local authority, if they then send the people to that school, is saying we're breaking the legal guarantee because the school said we can't do Z. And so you end up with it being like the local authority can force a school to take them, but they do so with a potential legal challenge to the local authority. And of course, the problem there is that like everything sort of like it becomes a situation where the only pupils a school can reasonably say we can't take are people with an EHCP. Well, they're some of the most vulnerable pupils we have. So like all the incentives are wrong. But also the whole thing about SEND feels strange to me anyway, because SEND as a phrase, and this is, I'm going outside of funding, like doesn't really make any sense. It includes, you know, one of my friends has an adult child, 19 or 20 years old now, has Down syndrome, like very severely, like a very severe Down syndrome. Like SEND applies to him as much as it applies to pupils in a school who like might have trouble following instructions a bit and so on and need a bit of a reminder. Like that's not a useful phrase, like to encompass that total. And in 1 year, more than one school year prior to the pandemic, and I couldn't tell you the exact one, in their school career or in their school time, more than 50% of boys in England had been labelled as some level of SEND. Now, I'm sorry, that's not special anymore. In The Incredibles, I remember like Dash, he's like everyone's watched The Incredibles, right? And like it's not like not like, and Dash is running around a track really fast, and his mum says like, Dash, you can't do that. You've got to be like, you know, you've got to give people a chance. And he says, but I'm special, mum. And she says, everyone's special, Dash. And he says, that's another way of saying nobody is. Like, I think that's true. Like, you can't call everybody special and so on. And so that's another area where the system is, I think, broken a little bit. In one of my schools, we had a year, well, we had a few years, and I don't want to labour this point, where pupils came in, we had 30% of them labelled in some way as SEND. You know, we have a very high level of EHCP. Actually, the structure of our schools being so strict means that pupils who are autistic or on the autistic spectrum, like generally like the kind of structure and the routine and so on that we implement. So we have a high level of EHCPs, but we tend to, because of the way we run the school, just take them off the SEND register and kind of like, you know, the stuff we do anyway provides for them. So it looks like if you take the 2019 results for our school, I think it's 2019, and it's typical afterwards as well, that we had 30% of kids come in as SEND. When they leave, it's 4%. It looks like we kicked them all out, but actually we've just like taken the label off them. And critically, those 4% need some special things, and our results look like our kids with SEND do really badly because it's those 4% who really still need like something special. But actually, if you track the results of the pupils who we'd taken off the register, our pupils who entered with SEND just by removing the label outperform their peers. Like, and so there's something wrong with that as well, right? Like, just removing the label and doing what we do for those pupils meant that they outperform their peers. And so the whole thing just needs, like, I think it's a 10-year project minimum. It's a political leadership project. Like, you will, as I'm sure, have had desperate parents contact you to say, no school will take my child, or like, no school will provide what I need for my child, I don't know what to do, like, etc., etc. Like, it's all like, and my heart goes out to those parents. Like, I think there's like a real job for us to focus on that. And so when we talk about funding, I don't think it's really Cambridgeshire, it's really schools and so on. I think it's like, where do we target funding, and what is the strategic plan for making sure that, and let's be honest, the cost of EHCPs like is meaning that local authorities have gone bankrupt across the country and are under pressure because it far outstrips the budget. Like, so how do we manage that? How do we make sure that we don't like artificially remove entitlements to young people that they need because they genuinely have disabilities, like, and so on? Like, how do, like, all that question is a strategic question that just needs fixing. And no, I haven't met anybody actually who disagrees that SEND is broken. We have different ideas about how to fix it, but yeah, anyway, that's my thing on funding.
I think it's a really challenging topic. And like, I was in children's committee, the committee cycles restarted this week, and there were like two, like, we were looking at the risk register, like in the children's committee, and like one, well, unsurprisingly, like the SEND budget, but the second one is actually how unsustainable home to school transport is. In general, like especially in a rural county like Cambridgeshire, and that is again a debate that will take a lot of, like, you know, cross-departmental working and integrating transport, because of course it's one of those things as well where, like, you know, specialist transport is needed for some people, but for some it's really wouldn't be needed if there are other options in place. So it is very not the same, but it's a similar parallel to SEND. Like, there are situations where if you had other provision in the system, like in this case, you know, like the example of having buses in some villages, you wouldn't need to spend so much of the budget on taxis, for example, or individual transport, whilst recognizing that specialist transport is needed for some children. But yeah, on SEND, I think I agree, it's like such a long, it takes a lot of like, I think, political decision on that. And also like we're just reflecting in terms of at what point like the individual choice matters as well. I remember being not at school but in university when some of my colleagues were saying, oh, but did you know you can get more time in exams and you can get this laptop for free and this, and that actually I probably could, but like I don't think I actually need it. So actually being able to say, to be empowered to have that choice and be at least try to be in that space. But it was really interesting because I was actually, by some people encouraged to go on that route, although like, in the end of the day I probably wouldn't have needed it and others needed more. So I think it's a very kind of difficult area to assess when is actually necessary to have like kind of special provision or not.
I couldn't agree more with everything you just said, and I know that we want to wrap up pretty soon. But I just like there's one local authority in the country that it's also not research based. So there's one local authority in the country where I believe, and this may be like Chinese whispers or not true or whatever it might be, but I believe that more than 50% of EHCPs include Lego play therapy. So a commercial company has got into the heads of a local authority and is benefiting significantly from like. I can't believe that 50% of kids in that local authority happen to need a specific commercial intervention. And so there's no kind of there's limited research base. I just want to be really clear though, because it sounds like I'm saying some controversial things. I'm not saying any individual child doesn't have SEND or I don't know. I'm just saying that the system is broken and it needs reimagining from the bottom up. And I think that's a fundamental funding question.
So I think we should probably start wrapping up. Stuart, thank you ever so much for coming on. I think to have a school leader on for an hour and 3/4 is just fantastic. And we've had sort of around 500 people watching, which is great. So really appreciate you coming on.
Great.
Any final thoughts, Martin, Alex, Stuart?
I was just thinking that it requires like a kind of, we can do a 10-hour live stream, because if we start on home to school transport, I think we can be on for 5 hours. But I guess like, my final question to Stuart would be like, now that we have a new government, do you expect anything would change? And if so, what would you like as a school leader to change in the shorter term as well as in the longer term, like kind of to summarize it?
Very good. So I was lucky enough to be invited to the reception at the DFE that Bridget Phillipson, the Secretary of State, put on just after the election, and it's very clear that there's going to be a limited amount they can do because of the well-publicised phrase black hole in funding, and it's very clear that that's going to be very difficult. The main thing that I really want, and they've already launched a curriculum review of the national curriculum, which all schools, including academies, are going to have to teach. I think they've appointed Becky Francis to that. I think that's smart to do so. They've talked about the changes to Ofsted. I'm less sure about those, but I think they've got a democratic mandate to do so. The main thing that I would say, if I had the ear of the Secretary of State or the ministerial team, is that there's this is very, education's better than it was in 2010. Schools are better than they were in 2010, right? And I'm a Labour Party member saying that. I think we've made significant progress. I think there's a strong case to be made that it's despite the government rather than because of, but nonetheless, I think we're in a better state. Schools in general are better. So I just would be wary about the unintended consequences of changes. And so rather than saying I want loads of change, I'd be like, hang on a minute, people are doing good things and making progress. Just be careful about the levers you pull as to the unintended consequences in an area that perhaps doesn't need as much focus as, for example, health, transport, whatever. That would be my overwhelming message. And then the second thing would be but get a strategic plan for SEND, beyond the length of this parliament. Also, I don't know if we're done, but I want to say thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed it, and I better go on my job.
Yes, I think it's true for all of us. I'm not sure if Martin, I interrupt you if you want to say anything in conclusion.
No, it's been fantastic. I've really enjoyed it. It's a nice sort of stimulating conversation, and I think the number of people that have watched this, I think says it all as well. I've really enjoyed it, Stuart. Thank you.
David, you're on mute.
Do you know, after all of the experience of COVID, I work from home. I do almost all my meetings. You would think I would learn to unmute myself before I talk on a video call. Still not that. Just to finish, we'll be back next week on Friday at 7:30 ish. One more time, we do have a new website, coffeebusesinpolitics.com. Do go and take a look. If you've got any questions on whatever it is that you'd like us to look at, there's a thing on the front page. Obviously, still join in on the chat and so on. And our Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube are rolling across the screen now. Do please follow us on all of those. And with that, I think we'll wrap up. So take care and see you next week. Bye.
See you next week. Bye.